Well, thank you very much, everybody. So, I am here to talk about responsive web applications. So, a very specific application of responsive web design, but a very sort of, I guess, with a little bit of a twist. I want to talk about container queries. So, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of history on what I've been doing for work. I most recently was working for a company called Xero. They do online accounting software. In fact, their tagline is beautiful accounting software, right? Accounting, it's the most beautiful thing. Now, when you go into the application, you're doing some stuff, and maybe, let's say, these tabs here, I want to do some stuff here. I'm going to actually click on my bank statements. So I click on my bank statements, and suddenly I get to this screen. Now, I don't know if you can tell, so I've just gone from one screen to the next, and the design of those tabs have actually changed. Okay, well, that's not really a big deal. But let's say I want to click on that button for getting my bank feeds. And then when I click on there, again, the design changes. The style of the buttons are different. The style of the inputs are different. I have just gone through 2 interactions, and the design has shifted on me as a user, going from one screen to the next. And so you can obviously see that there's a discontinuity in the design. And so when I came in, one of the things that they wanted to do was evolve the design. Now, obviously, we saw an evolution of the design from one page to the next. That's really not the best way to evolve a design. Normally, we want to evolve the design of an entire application, right? We want that consistency from beginning to end. That builds confidence in the users so that when they're going through, they don't think this is just hacked together with duct tape. And one of the other things was, this is an application that had and still does exist for 10 years. Some of the stuff that was built 10 years ago is still in use today. And so if you can think back to 2006, 2007, responsive web design as an idea, as a concept, didn't really exist. The iPhone had just come out. The iPad wasn't around yet. And so after 10 years, the idea of building for multiple devices was now a thing. And so one of the other things that we wanted to do was support multiple devices. Okay, so before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit about sort of at the beginning of my product development career at Yahoo. Now, admittedly, the Yahoo logo used to look like that. Of course, the Yahoo logo now looks like this. But when I came in there, one of the things they wanted to do was evolve the design. They had their communication suite of products, mail, messenger, calendar, and a whole bunch of other things that they wanted to redesign. They wanted to bring it up to make it look and feel more modern. And the other major thing that we needed to do was support multiple devices. Now, at the time that I started there, this was 2009. Again, this is before the idea of responsive web design as a concept. And as you can probably remember from back then, a lot of stuff was designed as sort of these monolithic applications. So in this case, we had the old version of Yahoo Mail. And interestingly enough, there was actually 2 different mail designs. So they had what they call the classic version, which is what you see here. And then they had redesigned it to be more like a web application, like a desktop application that was all completely JavaScript driven. There was like a pane on the left, and when you clicked on something, it loaded the stuff in the middle area. The problem is that only half their users migrated over to the new one. So they had 150 million users on one version and 150 million users on another. And so when I came in, they're like, let's build a third version. Of course, the idea was, let's build something to migrate both of those into one platform. And we did that very successfully. Now, again, when we went through this redesign process, we were thinking of the iPad and the iPhone and all these other devices that were now around, and how do we build and support those devices? And the way that we did it at Yahoo is that we actually built separate designs. So they were different look and feel. For the mobile platforms, this is actually an area where they could be a little bit more adventurous. See, the problem is that when you get to a certain size, when you have 300 million people on a product, management gets a little scared that you're going to scare off 300 million people and they're going to go off to something else like Gmail. Because, I mean, nobody here uses Gmail, right? Okay. So for the mobile platform, they were actually a little bit more adventurous, and we can try to do some different things. And one, like for example, the design between the phone and the tablet was actually a lot more consistent, but they were still built with separate teams. So there was a team that worked on the iPhone design. There was a team that worked on the iPad design. There was a team that worked on the desktop design, and different development teams for all that stuff. And you know, one of the things that I tried to do was, well, how can we establish a little bit of consistency, not only across devices, but also across different products? Like I said, mail, messenger, calendar, and whatnot. Because what had traditionally happened was a team would be provided a Photoshop comp. The engineering team would go off and build that. And then 3 to 6 months later, they would come back and we're like, hey, we're done. And the designers would be like, that wasn't quite what I meant by that thing. And of course, if you can imagine, if I gave each of you a Photoshop comp, how many of you would code that exactly the same way? You guys are always going to have different interpretations on what something might work. You know, how does this thing work? How do I actually use it? What does it look like? Maybe I look at the design and like, that looks like a 3-pixel border radius, and somebody else goes, no, that's definitely 2. Right? And these little inconsistencies grow throughout a product. And so when I was there trying to create this consistency through a design system, but we were still looking at a device-specific design and development, because they were big enough to have a team of designers and developers for each platform. Now, I worked there for a couple of years. We successfully relaunched the product, moved 300 million people over to a new platform. It was a lot of fun. But looking for new challenges, I ended up actually working for another company based in Ottawa, where I am from, Ottawa, Canada. And at the time, Shopify was under 100 people. The actual product team that I was on was a team of 4 designers and about maybe a dozen developers. So that's a lot easier to work within as opposed to a development team of 200 to 300 people. Now, as you might be able to predict, when I came in here, what did we want to do? Evolve the design and support multiple devices. Seems to be a common trend with a lot of the companies that I work for. See, when I came to work there, this was the design of the Shopify Admin. For anybody who's done any Rails development, this kind of look and feel probably feels familiar. But we wanted to evolve this. And again, we wanted to do this so consistently throughout the entire application had the same look and feel. And can we do this in a way that supported multiple devices and allowed us to iterate on the design? In fact, since then, the design has changed again, and they're working on another design iteration. That ability to improve on the product quickly and easily. See, when I came in at Xero, some of the things that I noticed were that, to actually make these design changes as a designer was really difficult. So much so that you ran into those inconsistencies from one page to the next. Now, one of the things from a development perspective was that it was a monolithic app. And that, when I say accessible templates, what I mean is accessible from a designer or developer perspective, that I could easily go in, edit the HTML, I could make a Git pull request, and I could have something in to production by the end of the day. And I think that's a very important thing in order to be able to iterate quickly and change design. So as a designer, I could go through and change the look and feel of every single button, get my pull request, get it approved, and be done by the end of the day. That's a great situation to be in. But again, Shopify, similar to Xero, was originally designed in 2006. And even going through these redesign processes, we're like, well, how do we handle the mobile web? Well, at first we just ignored it. Nobody uses mobile. It was complex. How do we think of these things, this entire application with user-generated content, how do we fit this into this small device when it has traditionally been designed for a full screen? We did try building a native application, but it turns out when you're a small company, you don't have a lot of resources, you have to take shortcuts. We didn't build out all the functionality that the desktop had into the mobile app. We could only pick certain features. So you could do order management, but at first you couldn't do product management. Once you had product management, well, you couldn't do the full WYSIWYG editing, you could just do some simple changes. So of course, whenever you have a limited set of features, people tend not to use it. Now, on the flip side, from a marketing perspective, we were actually able to go responsive really quickly. We didn't have all these dependencies. And when you look at most sort of marketing sites or most content-based sites, they have, from a design perspective, the ability to look at things from edge to edge. In other words, if I've got that top navigation, I can see this as sort of this cohesive piece. This hero image is a full cohesive piece from edge to edge of the screen. Even these boxes, even though I've only, I've split it up into 3, that whole area can be looked at as this one piece, and I can decide how that should respond when I move to a smaller device. So I'm on the phone, and you can see, so the navigation collapses. That hero image is still there, but we sort of rejig, we move things around. And likewise for those 3 boxes, we just stack them, right? We make these kind of design decisions. These patterns are pretty consistent. We know what to expect in a lot of ways when we're building these types of websites. So again, each horizontal block is considered in the context of the viewport. And of course, from a development perspective, how do we handle designing for different viewports? Using media queries. The browser gives us that technology now and has for years in being able to say, okay, based on the viewport, let me change things around. I'll give you another example. ClearLeft website, similar thing, right? You've got that top bar, you've got the navigation, you've got this hero image, and then when we move to mobile, each of those is treated as these pieces from edge to edge. Of course, the Frontend United's website, same thing. You've got that top navigation, you've got this main hero thing. When we move to mobile, each of those things is seen as this cohesive piece. And that means that each page can be art directed more easily. And that's a great thing, right? So we've seen a lot of this stuff develop and evolve over time. But for web applications, things can be a little bit more complicated. Now this page, for example, within Shopify might seem fairly straightforward. There's, we've got a side navigation, we've got this top bar, we've got this content area. But from an art direction perspective, how do we handle things like the fact that I don't have any orders? If I don't have any orders, what do I see? Do I just see a blank page? No, I probably want to see some helpful information. Okay, well, what if I have one order? What does that look like? What if I have less than 1 page of orders? Do I have pagination in there already? Maybe yes, maybe no. If I've got multiple pages. Do I have any notifications that appear at the top of the page, at the bottom of the page? Are they error messages? Are they info messages? What do those look like under different situations? You may have noticed those tabs. You actually have the ability to add new tabs. What happens when we run out of room because there's too many tabs? Warning notifications, limited access to features. If you have somebody who shouldn't be modifying products, what happens when they go in and do certain things? And so all these different things now have to be considered, not only for those scenarios, but now have to be considered across multiple viewports. What do each of those things look like on a phone, on a tablet, on the desktop, on a really big desktop, on a watch, right? From a design perspective, there's a lot more to consider. If you're building a website for multiple languages, how do you design each of those things? For any of you that was here for Vitaly's talk yesterday, he was showing some of the stuff that the BBC had done to actually designed for multilingual websites and the approach that they took, which, interestingly enough, is actually very similar to the approach that we took at Shopify. See, the thing is that even just with one particular page within the web application, it can have dozens, if not really hundreds of variations because of these types of design decisions. And now, a component-based site has components respondingly to different and multiple contexts. And what I mean by that, for example, is, okay, let's say we have these graphs. And you can see here on this particular page, I have two different pieces of information. I have two graphs, I have two bars. I'm going to split this 50-50, but what happens if I only have one? What happens? Do I only have one on the left? Do I only have one on the right? Do I have these sort of weird big gaps on the page? Or do I need to say, okay, well, when I've only got one, maybe we do something like this. I've got now, because I have this full screen, I'm going to put the graph to the right and some of that metadata off to the left. I can change the design because I have more room. But to do this on a page-by-page basis would be a lot of work. It's a lot easier to think mentally from how much room does this component, this box that I'm designing, how does it work based on the space it has available? And traditionally, we haven't really had the technology to do that. So again, when we look at media queries, you have to know the interplay of all objects in all scenarios, because you have to do it based on the entire width of the viewport. But what if? What if we had something like container queries, where we could base a query on the space that we had available and redesign that component based on that space available? And that's really where container queries come in. So you only have to know the interplay within a single object. So from a design perspective, even from a development perspective, that is a lot easier to manage. And then you can simply work through each component and how it looks and works within your design. You're going to have a limited number of components within your design. Anybody that comes to me and says, I've got like 200 components in my application, I'm going to say, why? Like, do you have 20 different designs for your carousels? You probably don't need that many. Do you have 20 different designs for your buttons? You probably don't need that many. So you're only going to have a certain limited number of objects, these modules, these components on your design. Now, container query sounds awesome, doesn't it? And you're probably wondering, for some of you at least, how do we get this magical technology? And the problem is that right now, we don't. I cry tears every night. Because the problem is there's no spec in CSS that allows us to do this on a per module basis. And that means we have to bring the heavy hitter out. React. I kid, we don't actually need React. We can use JavaScript, right? React isn't the only thing in the world. We have JavaScript to do this stuff. Now, since we need JavaScript to come in here and we need it to say, okay, based on the width of what this object is doing, do something with it. And the thing is that do something, we need to declare what that is. And we can declare that in the CSS, which is probably what most of us would expect. We could declare that in the HTML, or we could actually declare it in the JavaScript, since that's where the component query stuff is going to be doing its work anyway. And there's actually some pros and cons to each of those. So how many of you would say we should define these things in our CSS file? We're going to say a container query. A lot of hands. How about HTML? Who likes to do this in the HTML? A couple of hands. JavaScript. I'm going to define this in the JavaScript. A few more hands. Most of you want to define this in the CSS, right? Because this feels like a natural place for it. And if you look at some of the libraries out there, there's a bunch of them. A lot of them do take a CSS approach. So for example, the first one, it has like this :media idea. And again, these are all ideas that different people have come up with. None of this exists as a spec. So if you're trying to implement this in a project right now, whatever you do is almost assuredly going to change the moment somebody actually writes a spec. I mean, maybe you'll get lucky and that top one is the way we'll go, but maybe the bottom approach will be the way somebody goes. But we declare this stuff in the CSS, and then the JavaScript will come in, read the CSS, and actually do the container query magic. Here's another concept. Elementqueries.com, actually the guy that runs that website and the JavaScript library behind it, he's a fellow Canadian, super passionate about element queries, container queries, and so he's definitely check out his library. But again, you kind of say like, here's the element, here's the media query, and with elementqueries.com, he goes like really far in like minimum characters, minimum child elements, all these things that you wouldn't even think maybe you'd want to query on. He has these ideas that we can implement. For most people, certainly the stuff that we were doing at Shopify when we were implementing container queries, the only thing we cared about was width. How much width did this have? Based on that, let's redesign some stuff. And again, just another concept. So the thing is that if you put this in the CSS, the thing is you need to be able to parse the CSS, which means the CSS needs to be on the same domain as your JavaScript, or you need to set up something like the cross-origin, I always forget what CORS stands for, cross-origin resource sharing. Thank you very much. I had a feeling you would know the answer to that one. And so with us at Shopify, we were dealing with content delivery networks, and we're like, do we want to talk to the ops team to get this stuff set up? We just said, okay, that's too much work. We're not going to put it into the CSS. So that left us with HTML and JavaScript where we could define this stuff. So if we put this in the HTML, for example, we could just use a data attribute. This library has this data attribute where you say like, okay, small, medium, large. And again, the JavaScript goes in, reads the HTML, and will do its magic. For us, again, looking at how Shopify was built, its templating was, to put it bluntly, we didn't really reuse things. In other words, when a designer or developer was building a new page, what they did is they copied and pasted from another page, and they pasted it on a new page, which for the most part works, but developers that weren't familiar with CSS may not have noticed certain things. Maybe they forgot a class name, maybe they had deleted some stuff that needed to be there, and we realized that it was going to be a little bit more difficult to maintain that consistency because we didn't, even though we had kind of designed things at a component level, we hadn't implemented it at the HTML at a component level. And so copying and pasting stuff can introduce errors, and so we again thought, you know what, this is probably not the approach that we want to use. So again, HTML requires the consistency of an implementation across the app, which for anybody that's building a design system, is building an API, Lonely Planet's design system is probably a good one to look at, where they've built an API that will spit out the HTML for each of their components. Shopify has a new design system that they've released about a month ago called Polaris, which which now actually uses React to spit out its HTML for the stuff here. But at the time, since we had eliminated HTML and we had eliminated CSS, we decided to implement it in JavaScript. We had built our own container query JavaScript in order to do the magic that we needed to do. And the syntax that we came up with, again, we're inventing our own little world. All we did is we said, okay, well, what's the module name? We gave it a class name. We said, well, when this thing triggers, what class are we going to put it on? So, in this case, if we had flex21, if it met the minimum and maximum width parameters that we had set on this, it would apply that class to our object. And then as a result, we'd just pick up any styles that we had defined within that class. And now, one of the great things is that when we did this approach, anytime new features were being built, going responsive meant that we had a consistent feature across all devices, right? This is kind of one of the reasons why we want to go responsive. So if we were building a separate application for phone, tablet, or desktop, you're going to have to triplicate all the work for every feature that you're developing. Whereas in this case, every new feature, as long as they're using the components that we've designed, will automatically be cross-platform. It's the whole idea for responsive web design. And so new features automatically have cross-device support. And so we ended up actually reaching that goal and having a responsive web application. This is pretty much, if you go in there even today, I haven't been there for 2 years, and the admin is still responsive. And the great thing is that we were able to do this in under a month. By using container queries, we went responsive really quickly. Now that sounds really pie in the sky. How do we actually sort of pull this off? And I do have an asterisk here. We have a footnote. There are some gotchas, some things to think about. The first one was the design considerations. What do these components look like? How do they behave on multiple devices? We actually done this design work months in advance. So as new designs were being done, even though we hadn't built the code out for it yet, we knew how these components were going to look, work, and feel. At least some of them, not all of them. We still had a lot of work to do. And then we were able to go component by component. We took a look at, okay, what does our grid do? What do our cards do? What does the rich text editor do? What does the navigation do? The top nav, all of these things, and we were able to tackle it one by one. And the great thing is that once we had tackled a component and we knew from a code perspective how it would work, we weren't running into this situation where some stuff worked and some stuff didn't. Once a component worked, it just worked. What that meant was that we could continue to work in a non-responsive design, right? Because if the stuff is full screen, if we're saying the page is minimum 900 pixels, if we throw it on a phone and say the width is minimum 900 pixels, then all of those responsive components are still working well within that design. So we could continue to iterate without having to worry about breaking things. And of course, the best part was the day we actually got to flip the switch. Right? Once we had gone through and said, you know what, we are satisfied with where the design of these components are. We think we have created the experience that we want. We flipped the switch, and magically everything worked. Okay, mostly. There were definitely some crevices within the application that we just said, you know what, this is too difficult to solve right now. We have gotten most of the way there. This is an acceptable situation for us. And so this was a template editor where you could go in and modify the templates, the HTML templates within your storefront. And as you can see, it's a clearly broken experience. And we were kind of okay with that. It's like, fine, let's ignore it and move on to the other stuff. Some of the other scenarios that you can run into as well is performance, a perceived performance of this JavaScript running. And I'll give you an example. This is with the element queries library running just on the demo site. And so you'll notice that I'm going to add these elements to this thing. And when I get to a minimum thing, there was a delay when I added that last element and when it actually changed the background color. Here, I'll do it again. So I'm going to add children, and once I have 5 child elements added to this container, it's going to change the color. But there's a slight perceived difference in time between the moment I add that element and when it actually applies the style. And this is just something that JavaScript, unfortunately, we've got a single pipeline of stuff from rendering, from the JavaScript running. There is inherently going to be a delay with this particular approach. And unfortunately, it wasn't. We kind of said, okay, you know what, this might happen with our designs. Generally, it only happens when you're resizing the page, and we're okay with that perceived performance because most people, under most conditions, are not going to run into that situation. One of the other things that we noticed when we went through this process was, from a CSS perspective, that it wasn't about the properties, it was about the purpose. One of the things from a developer perspective, and I actually kind of ran into a number of arguments with my team where it's like, we were using Flexbox. People were so excited to use Flexbox. No longer we were dealing with these sort of complex floated layouts, but there was this natural attraction to building this grid system like 960GS, like Bootstrap, and just having this sort of monolithic grid system that handled every situation. But inevitably, what would happen is like, well, okay, we've got a grid inside of a grid, and therefore we need to remove padding and margin under different situations. Sometimes we would have like embedded elements that need to show and hide. And so under those situations, there's different padding. And we basically started adding exception after exception after exception. And then once you start looking at the mobile story, okay, well, we've got this grid, but a grid system under all conditions is not going to respond to a smaller device in the same way under all situations. And so what we found is that we just kind of needed to rewrite a lot of our stuff and simplify. So for example, our grid system, we've got this column on the left and the column on the right. There was another design where the smaller column was on the left instead of the right. We had this other design where we had this sort of sections with informative labels on the left, with the cards on the right. And each of these were different. And so instead of trying to use a grid class for everything, what we did is we kind of identified what are these different layouts, and let's build the CSS just for those particular layouts. And that way we can decide as well how those things should respond under those situations. And as a result of that, we were able to actually end up with less edge cases. We were able to end up with less code. And now some of you might be thinking, oh, but you're repeating those Flexbox properties over and over again. Isn't that going to actually bloat things? And the fact is that gzip actually minimizes duplicate properties really well. From a design perspective, tables are difficult, right? And the reason why is because you're dealing with a lot of horizontal data. Anytime you're dealing with a design that has a lot of horizontal data, it's very difficult to manage that from a design perspective on a small device. Here was an example. Here we have a list of products, and things just kind of look squished. We actually clipped the table, and you would have to scroll off to the right, assuming you knew there was stuff off to the right that you could scroll to in order to access that data. The designers came up with another idea where, we want a fixed left column and a fixed right column, and only that middle area can pan. And we tried to create some UI drop shadow so you could kind of tell that there was actually more information to the left and to the right. But the fact is that wasn't an ideal situation. In fact, if you look at Polaris, you can see how they've decided to tackle that problem now. It kind of looks table-ish, kind of looks like the product stuff that we had before, but instead of having sort of a more defined table, what they have is a thing that can linearize really easily. So where before we would have multiple columns, really what they had sort of a column to the left, a column to the right, and then the sort of descriptive text, so that when I do move down to a smaller screen, I can stack that information really easily. So again, coming from our design, finding ways that we can actually stack the data as opposed to having to go wide. So we want to avoid too much data on the horizontal axis. Another good example of that was the top navigation, right? We have an icon, we have this breadcrumb, we have the page title, we have all this navigation. And the way we had originally tried to solve this, we have our hamburger menu, because everybody loves hamburgers. We have our meatball menu, because everybody loves meatballs. And what would happen is that we had sort of our primary navigation, the save icon, and then we had our secondary navigation. So the moment you scrolled, that secondary navigation would disappear. Of course, if you go into Shopify now, they probably had felt that, this is really confusing. People weren't really sure how to interact. So they actually got rid of that sort of disappearing navigation. To which, personally, I feel like is not a better situation, but where they've sort of defaulted to putting any of that extra navigation, which, if we go back to the design before, sort of the duplicate and this sort of open in a new window icon, that stuff has now been embedded into that meatball icon. So just trying to show less navigation, but on a small screen, on a phone, you kind of lose everything. You lose the breadcrumbing, you lose the page title. So personally, I don't feel like this is a better situation, but they do a ton of user testing, and they probably just felt this works at least better than what they had before. So of course, when we go responsive, there's still going to be an iteration of designs, and how do we try to solve a lot of these problems? Okay, let me bring this back full circle, back to Xero. So as I mentioned, our goals were to evolve the design and support multiple devices. Now, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to reframe goal number one to be a little bit more explicit, which was allow anybody to make product-wide design changes quickly and easily. Because the problem was is that it was not easy. As it turned out, they had a few different problems. One was different teams, and each team actually got to pick their own tech stack. They had different deliverables, so anytime I wanted to make a design change, I needed to talk to the product managers of each individual team to make these changes. And that was a lot of work. And as I mentioned, different tech stacks. They had, you would go to one page and it would be running Ember. You go to another page, it's running jQuery and Prototype. You go to another page, it's running another JavaScript library, because each part of the application was built by a separate team using the tech stack that they knew and were familiar with. So how do you solve those kind of problems? Well, as you probably might know by now, a component-based approach works really well. That way we can reuse and iterate on those designs for those components. So we established a design systems team to define those patterns. What should those designs look like? We saw the changing design of the tabs. We saw the changing design of the buttons. Let's establish a consistent design that everybody has to follow. And I think the more important part was having a front-end team that was dedicated to building and maintaining components. See, the problem is if a new team was coming in and they didn't have an existing library of tools to use, they had to build things from scratch. And so they were going to build things that they were familiar with. Whereas if there was an existing toolkit, an existing library of things that they could use, then they were going to use those and they were going to be able to build more quickly and easily. Now, in this case, we did actually choose React. Mostly, we just needed to pick a system. In fact, Brad Frost had written a blog post recently talking about sort of agnosticism at a template level. At Yahoo, for example, we used Mustache. I am actually a really big fan of Mustache, and I like it for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't have a lot of features to it. It's actually quite simple. So you don't have the ability to run functions or anything like that. It's essentially, if it exists, render it. If it doesn't exist, don't render it. And I like that approach. And that means that all the work on the data has to happen well before it hits the template stage. So at Yahoo, we used Mustache because we were dealing with different product teams that possibly had different technologies. We knew we had to deal with PHP. We knew we had to deal with JavaScript. We thought we might have to deal with Java because a calendar, for example, when it was acquired from another company, was a Java-based product. And so we wanted a system, this technology that would allow us to work agnostic across all these different teams. With regards to Xero, we felt that React was the approach that might work the best. And so by building out these components, what we did is we made the right things easy and the wrong things hard. This became my mantra at Shopify that I sort of drilled into my team and to those within the company, because it was important to understand, how do we enable people to do the right things? Because the thing is that developers are lazy. I'm a developer. I know I am lazy. I will take the shortcuts to get things done because I just need to get the job done. I want it working. I don't necessarily care how well it's working. So if I have this toolkit, if I have these components, this API available to me, I will use it because it's going to save me time. Now, it's been a couple years since I've worked at Shopify. It's been a number of years since I've worked at Yahoo. What has changed in that time with the way they implement products? Well, as it turns out, Yahoo hasn't really changed their approach. They still do a custom experience per device. Shopify, however, has actually been getting rid of container queries. They felt like from a performance perspective, they were getting some negative issues coming in. Let's get rid of them. And one of the cool things is that, as it turns out, browsers give us some pretty cool technology now that do allow us to eliminate container queries without having to resort to going back to media queries. Take this design, for example. I've got a 2-column design, 60/30, and as I resize down, when I run out of room, I now have this stacked UI. And so I could do that. Again, I've just got two columns within my HTML that I've defined. And I can use display flex. Right? Flexbox gives us this capability because it deals on things sort of on a row by row basis. Once it doesn't have enough room to fit the two items on one row, it moved that item down to the next row, and it's like, okay, well, where do I, what the size is? If I was floating, I would have had these sort of weird things where one was taking 2/3 of the page and the other one was only taking 1/3, even though they were stacked on top. Whereas with Flexbox, it says, well, I've only got one item on the page, or on a particular row, it's going to resize and fill up that entire row with that particular item. And so, going back to our design, we resize, we have the two columns, and then as I resize down, I don't have enough room, it stacks the items. So this solves this from a design problem without needing media queries. This is really sort of like a container query approach to our design. Let's take a look at another example. In this case, these sort of info bars that we had, where we had an icon off to the left, we have our descriptive text saying what had happened, and then an action that needed to happen. Now, if I have enough room, I can put that action on the right, and you'll notice it's actually centered within the row that it is on. But once it runs out of room, it moves it to a new row, and when it does so, it can actually left align that item. Okay, let's look through the code for that one. So things were a little bit different, and then I've got my my media. So there's a couple of different things. Imagine our media object. So we've got our media icon, and then we've got our media body. And so within the body, we have our content, and then we have our actions. So that actions is that button that is off to the right-hand side. Now the first thing we need to do within our media body, similar to what we did before, display flex, flex wrap, wrap. That means once I can't fit anything on a particular row, start stacking the items instead. And for the content, I'm going to say, okay, flex base is 400. Basically, give me a minimum 400 pixels to work with. So if I can no longer fit within any of the items off to the right, it's going to move the items down. And it's set to flex grow. So if it does have more space, more than 400 pixels, it's going to grow that particular item within that particular row. The actions are, it's going to align itself center, top to bottom. Really easy, one line of code. And then, again, once it doesn't have any room, it just simply moves itself down to the next row. And again, going through that example, when I resize down, that button, boom. So we have this responsive design, again, that doesn't use any media queries. So we have this kind of flexibility. Now, these are sort of micro examples. There are maybe more complex examples that we can take a look at. So a couple of weeks ago, I was playing around specifically with grid and to see how well grid and flex might work together. And so I had put together this demo that, okay, well, if I want to have something that kind of looks like this container query approach, where you'll notice, how based on the amount of space that I have, the design of these objects where I've got the image and the text will respond based on how much room it has. If it has enough room, it'll put the text beside the image. If it doesn't have enough room, it'll throw the image on the top, stretching it to the full width of that particular container. But as I resize down, you'll notice that the grid that it's playing within, if I don't have room for these three objects, it's going to move that third one down onto the next row. But when it does that, it now has enough room to move that image back to the left of the text. So let's look at those boxes, right? The image with the text next to it. Similar to the media object, where I have my box image and I've got my box content. I could have called this media and have my media image and my media content. And I've defined my image, and I'm going to just say my image is going to be 150 pixels high regardless. I don't have a width. I don't know what my width is going to be yet. Again, on the box, I'm going to set display flex, and I'm going to say flex wrap, wrap. And that allows, when I don't have enough room for the items side by side, it's going to stack the items, each of them taking 100% of the width it has available. Now, the box image, if I have enough room. I'm going to grow it to the full width, but I'm not going to shrink it below 150 pixels. So it has a minimum 150 pixel width, and that means my minimum is going to be a square. I've already defined the height of 150. I now have a minimum width of 150. And the other sort of bit to this is this object fit cover. So when I do have this image now resizing to the full width, normally what that would do is just create this sort of weird stretched image. What I'm using here with object fit is it's going to take that image, and I have my container, the sort of, you can imagine the box where that image is, it's actually going to stretch the image to fit that, and it will crop the image for me without me having to do anything. So at least it still looks sort of normal depending on what kind of art direction that I'm looking for. When we go to the box content, in this case, I do want it to shrink below what I have or grow beyond what I have with whatever space I have available. But again, my flex basis, I'm going to say, give me a minimum sort of 60%. So once that container next to 150 pixels shrinks this container down below 60%, it's going to move down to the next line. So now that I have the design for the individual box, how do I get the actual grid stuff to work the way I had it working? And so I just have my items, and then within my items I have each individual box listed, and then we can use display grid. Now I'm not going to go into the display grid because tomorrow, at the beginning of the day, Rachel Andrews is going to be talking about grid stuff, so definitely check it out. But to go through that demo again, so again, if we look at each individual box, when I resize down, it can move the position around. Again, I haven't used a single media query. I haven't used any JavaScript in order to pull this off. And so browsers are giving us a lot of the technologies, a lot of the things that we can use without having to use container queries or media queries altogether. So to kind of sum things up, some of the stuff that you're going to need to think about, going back to work, thinking about how we can deal with responsive. One, obviously, is from a design perspective, you need to think about what that means well before you actually write a line of code, right? You need to think about what happens on a small screen, what happens on a big screen, and there are different approaches. My personal approach is that I want a consistent experience between all devices. Not all designers take that mentality. Sometimes they want completely different functionality on different devices, and that's a lot more difficult to consider because now you need to think about, well, if I take a list of tabs and I go onto a small screen and turn it into a drop-down, how much extra code do I need to actually pull off that functionality? Maybe I do actually need JavaScript to come in here and rework things. Maybe I'm hiding content on one viewport and showing it on another in order to pull that kind of stuff off. I do believe that container queries enable faster development. So even from a prototyping perspective, it allows us to build out ideas and test what that should look like and work like really quickly. I saw that work at Shopify. I saw that allow us to build out our design quickly. But of course, we can use techniques to avoid media or container queries altogether. Now at this point, if you're like, man, I really wish container queries, like as great as Flexbox is, as great as Grid is, I still want container queries. I still want this thing to exist. There is a group of people that are trying to make this happen. You can head off to ricg.io. So the Responsive Issues Community Group, formerly known as the Responsive Images Community Group, is trying to build some momentum, try to define a spec, try to work with browser developers to make container queries a thing. So if you are now excited and interested in making this happen, I invite you to check out that URL and get involved. And at that point, I would like to thank you very much. So I do believe we have a few minutes for questions, although I know it's the end of the day and you guys are probably hungry and thirsty, and although it's Greece, you guys eat late. I'm not used to that. I'm usually eating like right now. But I will take questions.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for a fantastic presentation. Sort of an inverse of the question that I asked Vitaly yesterday, whereas I asked, well, how could you do this with container queries? He showed a demonstration of different font weight and leading. Can you do something like that using Flexbox and Grid, or is it limited to adjusting the layout using Flexbox and Grid?
It is, well, they're layout technology, so that you're not going to be able to respond to things like line height and whatnot, font color, all those other things from a responsive perspective. Like if you wanted to change the design beyond laying out the items, then yes, you're going to need to look at things like JavaScript that would come in and move things around for you, change the properties for you. So that type of stuff isn't something that Flexbox or Container Queries is going to give you.
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to thank you very much. Oh, do we have one more?
We have one more question.
Okay, I won't cut you off then.
It's not actually on Flexbox specifically. You showed something on the Shopify website on mobile where there was a piece that wasn't quite working yet.
Yes.
Do you highlight that as such? Do you actually have a message in there saying, hey, this bit's a bit naff at the moment, but we're coming to it? Or...
That would be a fantastic idea. For us, no, we just left it broken. Like if you go in now, I believe it still looks completely broken. Because it was a case of like, it was in a lot of cases better than what it was before. And so that was on the phone. On tablet, where there is actually enough room, you could actually interact with it. So it's just a case of on sort of at an extreme, we hadn't taken the time to figure out how that should work and behave. And personally, I felt like that was a problem that could be solved. I thought that was a problem that we could, from a design perspective, it was just a matter of like how much time did we want to spend on that particular feature. And for us, we weren't seeing people A, use the feature, and B, use it on a phone for us to invest the time in actually dealing with it. Yeah.